So this is going to get pretty spooky pretty quickly and probably extremely offensive to certain people. So I'll just leave it at that and I guess get right into it. In the Gnostic cosmogony, originally there was the pleroma and the abyss beneath it. The abyss was a sort of endless watery chaos, while the pleroma was more or less the emanations from the monad, one, or what some people refer to as God. And the way this emanates is through a male and a female aeon, which is something like a cosmic intelligence of great capacity and great divinity. And they would further emanate creation from the first point, the monad, the prime mover, whatever you want to call it. After such a point, Sophia creates something of a monster by herself that takes the form of a lion-faced dragon that she names Yaldabaoth, or sometimes it's referred to as Samael, or the blind god. And in her error, she ends up throwing him into the abyss and putting him in a cloud that had a throne in the middle so that the immortal beings of the pleroma wouldn't know about it except for what is referred to as the Holy Spirit, called the Mother of the Living. Eventually, Sophia recognizes the mistake she made and she goes down to the abyss to talk with her creation. Well, what happens as she goes down, the light of herself ends up creating a shadow in the abyss, which was more or less a void. And as she goes down, she's apprehended by her creation, Yaldabaoth, and his archons, or, as it literally translates to, the rulers. Yaldabaoth ends up taking what is referred to as the light power from his mother, Sophia. Or as it was put in the revelation of the mysteries hidden in silence, Yaldabaoth is the chief ruler. He took great power, in parenthesis dynamis, from his mother, left her, and moved away from his birthplace. He assumed command, created realms for himself, with a brilliant flame that continues to exist even now. So what you have is something of a monster that was created in error, something that should have never been, gaining the power to basically create what it wants and do as it pleases. And because it found itself in the abyss where it was the only thing there, it convinced itself that it must be God. And that was when Sophia realized just how bad her mistake was and began to repent to the source, or the original Aeon. Or as it's put in the secret revelation of John, the chief ruler demonstrates his profound ignorance by boasting to his minions, "I am a jealous god, and there is none except me." When Sophia hears this lie, she realizes her error and repents. In an attempt to comfort her, Autogenes Christ descends to instruct the lower creation. His luminous image is revealed in the form of a human being in the waters below, and immediately Yaldabaoth and his minions seek to possess it. They now create a human likeness according to the image that they have seen in the waters, but their molded form cannot move because it has no life in it. Surreptitiously, the divine light persuades Yaldabaoth to breathe into the human form, and Adam becomes a living being, for the breath that Yaldabaoth breathes into Adam is the spirit he had stolen from his mother, Sophia. Left again with only soul substance, the spiritually bereft world rulers immediately see that their creation is superior to them, and they imprison Adam in a body of flesh in order to strengthen their faltering hold over him. As a result, humanity comes to be composed of spirit from the mother Sophia, soul from the psychic substance of Yaldabaoth and his angels, and flesh from the four elements of the earth. Humanity is thus made in the image of the divine, but formed in the likeness of the lower world rulers, enclosed in matter. Adam is temporarily ignorant of his true nature and origin, and becomes subject to passion, suffering, and death. It would probably be a good idea to talk a little bit more about the Archons now, so I will just quote John Lash, who's someone that has studied the Nag Hammadi material much more than I have. The entities they called Archons appear to be identical to the extraterrestrials of modern ufology. Both gray and reptilian types are explicitly described in the codices. I would estimate that up to 1/5 of the core material in the Nag Hammadi codices concerns the Archons, their origin, methods, and motives. And oftentimes it's said that the Archons are masters of virtual reality. Of course, it's not exactly said that way, but that would be the implication we draw today. Oh, it actually gets worse. From the first Apocrypha of James, whenever you are seized and you undergo death pangs, in parenthesis, mortal fear, a multitude of archons may turn on you, thinking they can capture you, and in particular, 3 of them will seize you, those who pose as toll collectors. Not only do they demand toll, but they take away souls by theft. So the toll collector bit I thought was kind of interesting, and it goes into, I think, describing something from the mythology of the time, which would be Chiron, the ferryman of Hades, who carries souls of the newly deceased across the river Styx and Acheron that divide the world of the living and the world of the dead. In a number of near-death experiences, people report that they encounter a consciousness that more or less asks how it would like to be seen. That's something that's sort of often encountered with UFO and extraterrestrial material. That these beings, they can appear how they'd like to. It's unlikely that they actually change, it's just that our perception of them changes. So it sounds like that same old trick if we're dealing with the same thing, which it may be that we're not. But if we are dealing with the same thing, then it makes some of the alien abduction encounters where people say that they feel the most intense love and whatnot, like just great feelings coming from these beings. And one abductee in particular would say, too bad it's not real, knowing that it was another kind of trick. People like David Jacobs tend to look at this as something of a tactic to make people feel special and to help with a sort of takeover. But if it's true that we are living more or less in the matrix of Yaldabaoth, then there wouldn't be any need or reason to take over the Earth unless it's just another strategy in keeping their human farm going. Because that's the only thing I can really relate this to, is that we're farm animals to beings of another kind of awareness, inorganic beings, and because they're inorganic and they have no real association with the pleroma, they must be parasitic in nature to continue existing. So the idea very quickly becomes that we are something like food to a monster that never should have been, but will exist as long as we feed it. And if that explains our relationship with this Yaldabaoth, well, I think it would explain why the Gnostic materials were repressed like nothing else I have ever heard of. Because it gives you direct means to challenge these so-called authorities that want you to believe they have a lot more power than they do, because ultimately their position is a losing one. Eventually, we will see through their tricks. Eventually, we will no longer be ignorant enough to allow ourselves to be food. The Secret Book of John puts it this way: Yaldabaoth, Demiurge, said to the authorities, archons, with him, "Come, let us create a human being after the image of God and with a likeness to ourselves, so that this human image may give us light." So you may be asking, well, why didn't Yaldabaoth just make his archons, receptacles for the light that he feeds on? And the answer appears to be that because he's something of an abomination, what he has created is also an abomination. And although he had created his own sort of cosmos, it was merely a reflection of the pleroma. And that is sort of where he gets to play God. And that is arguably where we find ourselves, right in the middle of this war between what shall always be and what should have never been. In the revelation or apocalypse of Adam, God, the ruler of the realms, or demiurge, and the powers, or archons, divided us in wrath, and we became 2 beings, and the glory in our hearts left us, me and your mother Eve, along with the first knowledge that breathed in us, and glory fled from us and entered another realm. Your mother Eve and I didn't come from this realm, but knowledge entered into the seed of the great eternal beings. For this reason I myself have called you by the name of that person who is the seed of the great generation or its predecessor. After those days, the eternal knowledge of the God of truth, or source, withdrew from me and your mother Eve. Then we learned about the inanimate material as we did about human beings. We recognized the God who created us, the Demiurge. We were not strangers to his powers, and we served him in fear and slavery. After these events, our hearts darkened, and I slept in my heart's darkened thought. When I heard these words from the great person standing before me, Eve and I sighed in our hearts, and the Lord, the God who created us, stood before us. He said, Adam, why were you both sighing in your hearts? Don't you know that I am the God who created you? I breathed into you a spirit of life as a living soul. Darkness came over our eyes. And I think the way that's phrased is interesting as well. He doesn't say, I created that spirit. He just says, I breathed that spirit of life into you. Then the God who created us created a son from himself in Eve, your mother. I knew a sweet desire for your mother, and the vigor of our eternal knowledge was destroyed in us, and weakness pursued us. The days of our life were few. I knew that I had come under the authority of death. It's interesting to note that death has been the threat that man has been controlled with the most. It's also interesting to note that in the active side of infinity, there are beings called flyers, inorganic parasites that feed on our awareness, and it's said that they gave us their minds to control us. And it may be something like that is where the fear of death really comes from. Because the one thing that is assured to these beings is that eventually they will die. Eventually they will cease to exist as they do now. Because man will no longer be in a fallen state. I think that may be an explanation for, realistically, the fall of man or the original sin. It wasn't something that we ourselves did, it was something that was done to us. It's probably a good idea to mention I'm not really going off of any personal belief in this. I'm just trying to describe something I've been researching for a little while now and I thought was interesting enough to try and present. And I think I've covered it enough for now. I would probably be getting out of my depths if I went too much farther. So I'll leave you with a quote from John Lear that very likely relates to this all. Don't go into the light. The light's a trick. Go into the darkness. In reference to near-death experiences that people discuss. There's often a light and a being that radiates love, but it appears that that's also a part of this control system, that if you go towards the light, you're making a conscious decision to return to this farm and to be food, but if you don't, then, perhaps if you have the correct knowledge and you know how to deal with these beings, you may return to the Pleroma, finally knowing the freedom that was always your birthright.